Mixed Media Movies.
And welcome back to Mixed Media. It is currently 11:30 p.m. Eastern Time as we're filming this. And if you didn't know, this is a live show as well as a podcast. So if you want to check out any links to see this live show, we go on usually for around 2 hours. Today is a little bit longer because I had a really excellent long interview with the folks at Catholic Game Reviews with Nathan. Talked about all kinds of things, including the progression of games and some hot takes that you can check out by checking out our podcast pages and our video pages. All right, so today I postponed my normal topic, or my scheduled topic, I should say, which was supposed to be the CIA and Hitchcock, which I had been hyping up and I was super excited for because I had sort of built up to this moment and our understanding of how art is influenced by economics, by different social factors, and by government, and so we're going through that whole thing. And then I want to talk about Hitchcock, great filmmaker, of course, with his interesting experience with the CIA. But I had a very busy week last week. And so I didn't get a chance to do the research that I wanted to do to make a really excellent episode. So instead, I thought of something different to talk about this week. So this week, I'm talking about black and white films. And not just any black and white films. I'll be talking about mostly modern black and white films. So post-black and white age, especially, as we see it sort of resurging in the last 3 years or so, becoming almost like a trendy thing to make black and white films, which seems kind of odd to people. And I want to break some of that down. So what are these black and white films that have been coming out? So I'll give you a list. So on the Oscars this year, on the stage, what comes to mind is the film Belfast, which I watched. A good film overall. And the film The Tragedy of Macbeth, which is what features in the thumbnail right there, which I've yet to see, but is definitely on my watch list. Some A-list actors in there that I want to see smash some Shakespeare very well. Hopefully, I cross my fingers. And so, these films were done in black and white on the Oscar stage, but there have been plenty of more films that have come out in black and white, including, let me get my list out here, The French Dispatch, which stars Timothy Chalamet, who is very trendy these days. I think he's a trendy figure amongst the ladies, is my understanding. So that is well beyond my years of that high school talk about the boy actor or whatever. But in any case, let's see. We've got The French Dispatch. Oh yes, very interestingly, Parasite recently came out. Parasite, the Oscar-winning film for Best Picture, I think in 2019, if I remember correctly, either that or 2018. Parasite was recut in black and white and came out recently, which is very interesting. And I'm sure there are a few more that I'm going to forget. Oh yes, there's Being the Ricardos apparently has a section in black and white. Needless to say, it's been appearing in expensive Hollywood films. So first of all, a little bit of history. Of course, filmmaking starts in black and white, right? In a lot of technically simpler ways, right? So we have black and white. We have actually using celluloid film. We have using really small film cells, like 8mm, which produces extremely grainy footage. You have the lack of sound, and so we start off with this primitive thing, which is just watching motion in 8mm at 24 frames a second on some really grainy, poorly rendered, poorly processed, 8mm black and white film. And we come all the way today where we have like 20K, whatever, digital, depth of field, whatever. You can throw out so many technical words to describe the advances that we have today. Now, sometime in the middle there, we made a huge transition from black and white to color. Now, I'm not super familiar with the technical aspects of that. I assume it's mostly a chemistry proposition with how the celluloid is constructed. But the more interesting thing is the era in between, where we have the availability of color film. But what happened after the availability of color film is not every film being made in color. And we're talking about, I believe, the late 50s or 50s, 60s, something like that, where we're making this transition.
Okay. I mean, the color comes about a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Because if you watch a show for a while, I talked about The Adventures of Robin Hood, which is an early film in color in 1930.
Right. Yes. So yes, the technology had been quite around for a while. The 909 Crime says the two-mode Technicolor era is underrated. TBH, big vibes going on there. There is some beautiful Technicolor. I wish I understood the science and the technical aspects of Technicolor a lot better. But even after looking at The Adventures of Robin Hood, after Ben talked about it briefly, the color rendition is gorgeous. It's something else. And I would love to explore it again, maybe in a little bit of a study. But in either case, though, we had a large era, multiple decades, where the technology was available, but it wasn't widely adopted. And of course, there's the expense of processing color film. That wasn't the driving factor. There was a sort of understanding that black and white was sort of part of the film tradition from from certain directors. I know Hitchcock talks about black and white a lot. He chose to make Psycho, which is a much later film than you might think, because it's in black and white when he has other color films. Whereas he chose to make something like The Birds in color, which is actually an earlier film. So, yes, there's a lot of thoughts in that era about black and white versus color. And there's good reason for that. So I'll go into that a little bit later. But first, I want to go into the new technology that is sort of bringing, I think, black and white back into the conversation. I can't really speak to the exact why for the trend that we're seeing now, and I really just want to focus more on why black and white has persisted for so long and why it works even today. So I can't really speak to the why it's so trendy these days, but I can imagine certain things that might have happened. Like, for example, a bunch of black and white digital cameras coming out, which was huge news when they came out, just purely black and white digital cameras. And you might ask yourself, well, why on earth would you want a black and white digital camera in 2022, right? So Red, which is a premier camera company, they make the Epic series of cameras and a whole bunch of other camera lines, very expensive. Red came out with a black and white version of their Mysterium series. So they released a camera called the Mysterium X, and it's a purely black and white monochrome sensor. And it went for $42,000 to give you an idea of expense. $42,000 for a black and white cinema camera. And then Ari, the other major film camera manufacturer, I would say probably the more popular in sort of the more traditional film spaces, even their digital cameras. Ari came out with their Alexa XT black and white, which had some other interesting technological things like high frame rate stuff and whatever, but the operating thing was it's all black and white. The only thing it can do is black and white. There's no mode. You can't switch it into color. It's just black and white. And I don't have the price in front of me, but I'm sure it's even more expensive than the Red version. I'm sure it's like something like $50,000, wouldn't surprise me whatsoever. And so you're asking yourself, why the heck would you do that? So I'm going to do a little bit of drawing real quick to explain to you the technology that is actually extremely simple to understand as to why you would want to create a digital camera like this. So let's get a little bit technical. So pixels, right, are the single units that make up digital images, right? So you have an array of pixels. So if I were to draw real quick, very poorly probably because I'm on my computer, you would have, oh boy, you would have, that's horrible. Let's try to do this better. Okay, it's going to be bad. you would have this is your image, and it's subdivided into a bunch of pixels that are you can imagine are actually of the same size, and each of these pixels has a color, right? So this pixel over here has a color. Let's say it's green. This pixel over here has a color. Let's say it's red. And then the magic is that your brain, well, it's not really your brain. There's a bunch of optics things going on. It has to do with resolution. You can see things. It's actually quite complicated. It's something I studied in college. But the interesting thing is that you interpret these discrete pixels of pixel information when you're looking at a digital image as a big cohesive image. And you can imagine how that happens. I don't think I have to explain that. The more interesting thing is what each of these pixels do to produce a color at all, right? Why not just bright or dark? Well, each of these pixels is actually not one cell. In fact, each of these pixels is actually 4 pixels. So let's take this green cell over here and erase this. Let's take the green cell. And if you're listening to podcast only, we have 4 little cells making up the one big pixel. And these 4 little cells making up the one big pixel each have a color. And the way each of these have a color is they put a little gel material on top of what's called a diode, which is what the cell really is, the thing that produces the light. They put a little gel over the diode to give it a color that it receives. So if light hits this pixel, it hits a green filter on top of a diode. All the non-green light gets filtered out, and then the remaining green light hits the diode, and that sends a signal to the digital components in your camera that do some crazy processing afterwards. So the typical layout of these things, I'm probably going to get wrong the directionality of it, but it's more or less 2 green pixels, 1 red pixel, and 1 blue pixel. And if you know anything about digital images, this is RGB, magically, right? So we think about digital images in terms of how much red there is, how much green there is, and how much blue there is in the entire image and in these particular pixels. So that's how this works. But what if you took off the coding of these particular cells? What would you have? Well, you'd lose all color information now, right? Because you couldn't tell the difference between a photon that has a lot of, or a photon rather, that's frequency is more like green versus more like red. You would only have intensity information now because you didn't do any filtering. So if I go ahead and undo this so that we remove those cells, all we have now are black and white cells, right? So this might be darker. Well, actually, they're all just the same, I should say. And now we're just telling the sensitivity in all 4 of those cells. So without doing any work or development or anything interesting to the sensor, I have actually just quadrupled the amount of spatial information by sacrificing color information. So now for every color cell I used to have in that sensor, now I have 4 black and white cells, which gives me what? It gives me massive amounts of resolution, right? So if I had a 10K, sensor before, or let's say 4K sensor before, now I actually have a 16K sensor all of a sudden by doing nothing or removing the coding off of these particular cells. That's the really basic science behind why these people came out with these cameras, because some people actually desire that level of resolution at the sacrifice of color. A lot of these are for commercials or other things, or things where you want to draw stills from them. So you want to be able to take a still out of the video and still be nice quality. But the primary thing is that you get a massive more amount of resolution. But there are other byproducts. So I'm not going to explain the math behind this and get into it too much. But basically, every pixel has a range of specificity. So if you're familiar with 8-bit, right, that's 256, I believe. possible values between 0 and 255 that any pixel could have for red, green, or blue, right? So red could be anywhere between 0 and 255, and so on and so forth for each individual cell in a color pixel. If I made that black and white now, what I could possibly do is I can describe more levels of gradation in the one resulting pixel information that gets recorded, because now instead of describing a red, a green, and a blue, taking up the same amount of data space, taking about the same amount of processing power, now I can describe a whole huge range of black and white, which is now going to be, is it quadruple or is it exponential? I don't know. You'd have to do the math. A huge range of black and white granularity, essentially. So what you end up getting is a lot more depth, not color depth, that's what you usually call it, tonal depth, right? So now, if you've ever been on YouTube and you see darker videos and unfortunately there's like some gradient in the background and you get what's called banding, where like the background has like these weird like bands of like, oh, this is white and then this is like a little bit gray and this is a little bit darker. What's happening there is that the YouTube playback, and YouTube compression is also garbage, but that's a whole story for another day. The YouTube playback doesn't have enough information to display colors that are in between the bands. It's too fine for it to show, basically, the difference between the one gray and the other gray. So what this allows you to do is get a lot more granular information in there. That's one thing. Last thing, technologically, that it does is it saves a ton of processing power. So the camera that I'm filming on right now, it's the Sony a7 IV. It's a very small body, which makes it extremely impressive because with its very small body and its passive cooling, entirely passive cooling, it has a pretty beefy processor in there that's doing some crazy post work to the image in order to produce natural colors. There's a whole bunch of complexity in there. I'm not going to get into it, but this is the kind of stuff that cinematographers like really get into the weeds over. It's why this 4K camera, which has a similar bit rate to my Blackmagic camera, looks a lot worse than my Blackmagic camera on some sense. Not a lot worse. I shouldn't disparage this camera. I love this camera. But, the Blackmagic camera has a lot of different stuff going on with physics, but it's also processing as well, and what you're able to do with passive cooling on this camera, as well as its form factor. Now, with black and white, you have a lot less complication in the processes that you have to do. It's a lot less complicated to figure out what exact color of green did my little sample from the scene actually be, rather than what just is the resulting intensity that I should record down, compensating for much less variables, much less complexity, much less interpixel complexity, etc., etc. As a result, I can have a lot more data being sent to my hard drive at a given time, as long as my hard drive can handle it, and a lot more data in terms of gradations of black and white being processed at a given time, which not only helps with the resolution or the granularity or the tonal depth, it also helps with dynamic range. It also helps me get better lows and highs. So if you ever try to take your phone outside and film, I don't know, a squirrel or something like that, what one problem you probably ran into is that your phone has terrible dynamic range, which is to say that if you want to get your squirrel, nice and lit so that you can see the squirrel nicely, you're probably going to get a white sky, even to the point where your phone's dynamic range is so bad that you'll have whited out trees because of the way the sun is hitting the trees. It's just too bright for it to record both simultaneously the dark parts of the scene and the bright parts of the scene, because the dynamic range is horrible. With black and white, it's a lot more possible to get huge dynamic range. Now, previously, this was film's thing, right? So film, despite the advances in digital, up until very recently, had way more dynamic range than digital. So despite all the advances in digital cameras, just simple celluloid film had better dynamic range than digital up until like a year ago, practically. And it's taken that long. But black and white propels the image well even beyond film in terms of dynamic range. So now you potentially take your black and white camera, bring it outside, and see both the sky and a shaded subject at the same time, which is a creative possibility that was never available to you without altering your scene with either lighting or doing something to your lens, a whole bunch of other things that, was done in cinema before. But now you can just take the camera straight out and film it just like that. So that's what black and white does. Now, of course, you're taking a huge hit, because if you want color information, none of this matters to you, right? Like, this doesn't matter to you at all unless you have the specific niche of making black and white content. But what it does do, if you're a director and you're a creator, is it gets your mind going, because now you have time to refinance my home. Hilarious. Now what you have is, the ability to use this new tool, which I guarantee you, I know how directors think. For this camera comes out despite it being $42,000. This is on the studio's dime. Who cares? You can think, maybe I will make a black and white film because I can experiment with these other things. So that's one of the things I think is going on here. Despite some of these films ended up being shot not on these new black and white cameras, like Belfast was shot on a color camera, just was processed into black and white. I still wouldn't be surprised if what prompted the thought was these cameras, becoming more prevalent. And one of the interesting things about the how the aesthetic developed in this new era of black and white, or this sort of trendiness of black and white, is that they're extremely digital, meaning they're not even trying to emulate film. They're not. A lot of times things are shot in digital for convenience or for a variety of different reasons. There's a million and one reasons why you might choose digital over film, despite pretty much universally everyone agreeing that film is much more gorgeous unless you have a specific look in mind that can only be achieved on digital. But but one thing that's done a lot is it's post-processed. Digital's post-processed to look like film. Now, I can usually tell the difference, regardless. I would say in 8 times out of 10, I can probably guess accurately, whether it's digital or film pretty well. Because from my optics background, as someone who studied optics in college, the big problem is that there are just things you cannot emulate, because physical analog processes, you don't actually have the information to know what would have happened. It's gone. Like there's no information. The information you need to know what happens when the light hits the emulsion of the film has more variables than the digital does. And because you did not record those variables with the digital, there's no way for you to emulate them accurately. It's literally just a information problem. So that's to say that this new aesthetic with black and white, a lot of it has not been around emulating film at all. Now, the example cell I have here, which is the Tragedy of Macbeth, actually is film. So that doesn't help with the example. But Belfast just looked like black and white digital. It was a digital black and white. It just was going for its own aesthetic, which amazingly hasn't been very well explored. It's something I realized when I sat there. I was like, this looks totally digital. It's not even trying to be film. But this aesthetic, I don't think, has ever really been explored in depth. And so I couldn't, I could definitely see filmmakers also saying to themselves, no one's really gone for this. Oh no, my camera died. That's really awkward. Or disconnected? That's really weird. Yeah, so I was just saying that, the aesthetic hasn't been really explored. So it's been interesting to see, okay, maybe some filmmakers are going to explore this aesthetic. Now, I want to talk for a moment about, and I'll be fast about this. I want to talk for a moment about color in general. So I would say I'm an amateur colorist. So I've done a few, projects where I've colored for productions. I don't consider myself, super masterful at it because it's a science and an art that is extremely complicated. And shout out to you colorists out there. Y'all are amazing. So this is the color wheel, right? So we've got all our different colors. This is called an HSL wheel. I won't bother you with the details, but it contains, in theory, a perfect HSL wheel would contain all colors that you could possibly see, right? Although it doesn't work out that way in real life in most circumstances. And so basically what you have when you have complementary colors is that colors that are opposite from each other on the HSL wheel are complementary. So you see at the top of the wheel you have red, and at the bottom you have cyan. So cyan is complementary to red. And you have magenta opposite to green, so magenta is complementary to green. If you've taken a painting class or anything like that, that's rather basic. You could probably go on and on about that. But that's not what I'm interested in talking about here. I just want to lay out, how color typically works and then show you different looks real quick. So of course we have black and white, but there's also something called monochrome, right? A monochrome color scheme, monochromism, right? And I'll give you an example of that here. So this is a scene, and if you're watching in post, it's a scene from, if you're listening, in post, this is a scene from Blade Runner 2049. And the director, Denis Villeneuve, he really loves his monochromism. And from the name and from the image, you could probably guess that monochromism basically just means one color is dominant. So in this frame here, yellow is just, is the only color that's presented only in shades, right? So that's monochromism. Then you have... this is another example from the same film. A little bit more complexity in the color because there are a little bit more variations. It's not literally just yellow. There's some red and some orange here and there. But if you took the HSL, you're literally occupying a very small slice of the HSL wheel to make up your colors. And the interesting thing about monochromism is it's essentially black and white. It is black and white in terms of what kind of information you're getting. The only extra piece of information you're getting is an overall color that's different from no color. It's all just gradations of the same color. It is black and white.
So it's just a tinted black and white image, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. That's not how it's produced, of course, but that's the overall, that's the ending effect, is essentially black and white. And monochromism is extremely popular. Especially in the more stylized the movie you get, it seems as the more color you subtract, from your overall palette. And again, Denis loves to do this. Then we have, that's funny. Let me fix that real quick. Let's see, something like this, which is this is not quite complementary, or it's not complementary at all. It's a two-tone look. That's not occupying a complementary space. But what it's doing is it's using two colors. This is from the movie Joker. And it's using two colors. So the vest is orange, and the rest of the color is this teal green, ghastly, gross color that's occupying the rest of the space. And if you watch the entire film, it's this two-tone look is prevalent throughout. All we've done is we've added another color, and now we have some color information. We've got this incredibly stylized look. And then if you take it to the other end of the spectrum, which is something that, let's say, not the extreme other end of the spectrum, but you take it a stylized look and you add even more color, you get something like this, which is from the opening scene in Inglourious Basterds, one of the best scenes of all time. And I'll fight you over that. This scene right here, there's a lot of color information, right? So there's a lot more. However, it's still constrained, right? So we've got an overall dominance of this teal in the jacket. The jacket was almost certainly just probably had a hint of teal. I'm sure it was mostly black on set, or the way it probably looked. But the colorist really brought out the teal, I'm sure, in the jacket. And it's doing a complementary thing with the orange of the skin tones and the earth tones of the table. But there's actually just a lot more color in general here. Like the skin tone colors are just completely different from the guy's wardrobe here. And we've got some greenish things happening in the background. It looks more true to life, although while remaining very stylized. And I could bring up an example. Let's say a film like Coda would be probably the far end, where it's like mostly naturally available colors. Still, anything that's colored is going to be stylized, as it should be, but much more sort of like true to life colors happening, not as constrained. The reason I show those examples is to show the variety of different kinds of ways you can approach color and how they affect the way we look at why black and white is interesting. The less color you have in the scene, it seems, the more stylized of a look you get. Well, maybe that's not the right way to put it. The more specific of a look you get, right? Like it's not sort of what they had on hand. It's a very specific set of colors, and they're really shoving it to the audience. These are the colors, right, that you're going to be looking at. And one of the interesting things, especially when I was thinking about this with monochromism and thinking about that as essentially black and white, is that in the sense of what they achieve, it's basically the same thing. What the things that these things bring out and point to you is to point away from color information and point towards the things that black and white really force you to look at, which is, I think, three things: texture, shape, and composition. Right. So texture being like, the details, right? So if you look at the image at the bottom there, the texture is just very grungy, right? It's very, very classic filmic type look. The stubble, the beard looks like, it's crunchy. You could reach out, and it's almost like the lack of color brings more attention to all the little textures that are going on in the image. As well as shape. So you can have very specific shaping of everything happening in a scene. So oftentimes in black and white films, you'll see silhouettes being a dominant tool being used. Not just the silhouettes of people, but the silhouettes of objects is more common. So you'll have these buildings at weird angles, presenting these interesting shapes. And those interesting shapes, because they're very obvious to you, can communicate something. So take the same building that was making, I don't know, like let's say you have a building that looks sort of like a spearhead, let's say, just as a random example. When it's shot at a specific angle, it's silhouetted against the sun, it looks like a spearhead. And maybe we're about to see something violent happen, on screen. And this is the preceding image we get, is this very sharp, pointy shape. If you took that same image, that same silhouetted image, and you made it color, the association becomes less strong with something that's more violent, right? There's more distraction in the sense of, there's other components to look at. Oh, it's blue and red, and these add a little bit more information that distract from the overall shape. And then there's composition, which is essentially what the overall frame is balanced like where things are positioned in the frame. So normally with color, there's color things that happen that change the composition, which is hard to describe without examples, which I didn't pull up. But like color can change the way you look at what's foreground, midground, background. Color can change the way that you perceive something's weight in the frame. So like how much space it seems to take up can be a lot more, let's say, if it's a red than if it's an earth tone, right? So there's compositional things that happen with color that you have to account for. With black and white, you're kind of freed a little bit from that, especially because you can adjust those contrasts in post very easily, and you can adjust those contrasts very easily on set. So because you don't have to worry about so much about how colors present as much as just how much luminance do they emit, right? What are these reflective surfaces emitting? What are these matte surfaces? Again, we're talking about textures, right? But then we're also talking about the overall balance of the lighting, which I've always found lighting in black and white films to be just mesmerizing. Watching these very stylized, just gorgeous, use of haloing and reflections and different lens effects happening, like ghosting, and just really taking it to the extreme in terms of basically how light bounces around the scene. Whereas with color, it becomes extremely unruly all of a sudden, because now if you're getting ghosting in your lens, it's a color now. Like it could be like, because of your lens, makeup and whatever, it could be magenta ghosting, but your color palette does not include magenta. So all of a sudden this tool is gone. You can't even use it, et cetera, et cetera. You get the point. So that's to say that the recent black and white is interesting, and I think it's a timeless look, and I think we can watch amazing films like, I was going to say like a ton of classics, in black and white, and still find it extremely compelling because although we lost some information, we're pointing to new information. And that new information is interesting in a different way. And this is stuff that people like Hitchcock talk about, is what are we exaggerating when we get in black and white versus when we're in color. Personally, don't really have any desire to shoot in black and white as is. It's not something that comes to mind with any of the scripts that I have. But this made me think about that, think about that a little bit more in terms of what would you want to do. And in terms of, last thing, in terms of commercial viability, a lot of these films do perfectly fine. A lot of these films don't even present them as gimmicks. That's just how they are. Like Tragedy of Macbeth, it's just in black and white. So you're going to watch it in black and white. And a lot of these films do well anyway. So it need not be an obstacle for viewers, especially if you don't present it with pretension, which might be an obstacle for some people. And you're like, oh, look at this thing in black and white. Look how great I am, or something like that. Look how trendy and hipster I am. Okay, that's probably going to turn off some people. But if you just made the decision and you're just going to rock with it, which is what's been happening a lot lately, power to you. Go for it, and have fun. So that's basically my my little thing about black and white.
I didn't know about the dynamic range thing about black and white.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know any of the science, but I will say as a complete, ignorant lay person, as it comes to all things visual and film, but just my experience watching some of these older films, like other films, Corn Gold, were kind of like the Seahawker in black and white, or things like Tarkovsky and Kurosawa. Right, I think only Kurosawa's very last film is in color, even though he's making films in the 90s. I don't know. My impression is that, and it probably also has to do with the difference in acting and directing, but it feels like the emotions are like easy to read without being hammered. They're not like thrown in your face.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense to me. I've noticed a lot, especially with film, because skin tones render so beautifully on film, and this again is a physics thing. It's not something you can just fix with more software. It doesn't work that way. But the way skin tones render on film, even in black and white, is so gorgeous. And a lot of times what happens, you get these just tight close-ups, especially in the more like romantic sort of period of filmmaking. You get these like tight close-ups, and you've got these special lenses just for these tight close-ups. And what's happening is all the skin texture on black and white film is just so readily apparent, and the way the skin moves and folds and creates these little micro expressions and all the beautiful human behavior, which is like almost all of film is just faces, right? Like you can distill down a lot of film to just looking at faces. I agree with you entirely that a lot of times, and yeah, there's a difference in acting. It's a little bit more romantic. There's a difference in directing and cinematography, in that era. But I would say even in something like Belfast, which doesn't even have the benefit of that beautiful rendering, the skin and the texture, whatever. I think I focused a little bit more on the acting, just that little bit more on the acting, as these movements and shapes become more part of what I'm paying attention to, because I don't have color information to distract me, quote unquote. It's just a trade-off, right? Between one decision and another. And one that I think is interesting with monochromism. So if you want color, and you want to even change the color from scene to scene, but you also want to preserve shape, think about doing it with monochromism, right? And just saying, this scene is yellow, or this narrow range of yellows, right? Or something like that. And then you can preserve this shape thing, but also provide a mood with the color itself. And so you can sort of have this interesting both things happening. So yeah. Cool. I think that was a fun little thing. It is now 12:15 a.m.
Is that a new record? Might be a new record.
I don't know. But if there's anyone still out there, thank you for watching. I think 909 Crime was still around. Savage. Awesome. And thank you so much for watching. Unfortunately, I'm really behind in editing, and I'm really trying to fix that, although I feel like I'm fighting an uphill battle here because I'm a little behind. So forgive me if some of these things come out later and a little bit out of order as well, as certain things take precedent over others. But the best thing that you could do, more than, I don't need money or anything like that, what I would love for you to do is smash the like button and share anything that you found interesting in the podcast, whether it's this episode, our music episodes, or gaming episodes, whatever you find interesting, share it with a friend that might enjoy it, and also leave a comment with anything that you would like us to do differently or like us to do more, whatever it may be, just let us know. So with that, I guess I'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching.
And thanks for watching and listening.
Look, tell a man no trouble, I don't want beef, man, I just want vibes. Big man like me, no need for the telephone hype. I got too much getting online. One rule, then dead I'm on site. Wrong move, I bet they gon' ride. No need for the telephone hype, nah. No need for the snoozing. Big whip outside, I'm cruising. Big stick inside, no losing. Better watch out for the snake and Judas is. Don't ask them who this is. I bet they know what I'm moving in. I bet I show it into a dim. How you hate and then lose again? How you hating my vibes? Why you wasting my time? Getting hype on my line. Tell a man I don't want feedback, I just want relax. Brand new whip, two-tone, I need that brand new hit. Like lean back, brand new bits I live in. We back, man, you never gon' like us. Get them on sight now, let them on light. That way they know I'm all righteous. Look at my life, I'm living alright. I'm nice, you know I'm alright. Cause looking like Christ, no need for the hype or fight or telephone vipers. No need for the telephone vipers.